This video is sponsored by place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where if I be still the same? And what I should be, all but less than he, whom thunder hath made greater. Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice, to reign is worth ambition, though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. In 1667, English poet John Milton published his epic poem Paradise Lost. In it, he depicted the fall of man. Morally speaking, climate change is gonna finish us off for sure, and consisted of two narrative arcs: Satan, his fall and his revenge scheme against man, and the fall of Adam and Eve as they are seduced by Satan, Lucifer, and all of his forces. While not meaning to, due to the nature of writing an epic, Milton became one of the first people to create sympathy for the devil. Pair that with Alexandre Cabanel's 1847 Fallen Angel, which you may notice from the memes, but is also epic as a fuck. You know, Cabanel was 24 years old when he created this art because of course a 20-something would come up with the idea of a single tier Satan. Despite Satan, Lucifer, the devil being an antagonistic force against mankind at best and the living embodiment of evil at worst, he has been a figure that has compelled writers, intellectuals, philosophers, academics for ages who study the Bible and biblical works, especially those who use the figure to explore something deeper about humanity and the vices that live within us. While certainly not the first figure to operate this way, and I totally concede to the Western-centric viewpoint, Satan in a lot of ways is the first Draco in leather pants, and I will explain that term later. You know, the original sad boy, because more than anything, he represents in the incarnations post Milton's work an inherent distrust of altruistic goodness. People don't trust goodness. Good is so often arbitrary and crafted by those in power. We have come to distrust the intentions of those who use their privilege in order to protect the world or have freedom from all that ego and power would create. But evil, despite the darkness, in a lot of ways is more honest to the way we view people and their desire to reshape the world. Their ambition, their pride is more human to us, more compelling to us, and more entrancing to us. And that's why we want to f the bad guy. Yeah, don't let this academic intro fool you. This is a horny video. Being interested in, the bad, evil character is almost cliche at this point, but like many things, it is rooted in truth. People like villains, anti-heroes, characters that push back against the black and white morality that so many of us were indoctrinated with, and in a lot of ways, depending on how you were raised and with religion, can be based in homophobia, transphobia, racism, etc. But in this post, Your Fave is Problematic World, being attracted to a villain, an antagonist, or an anti-hero means landing face down in like a wading pool of discourse that you don't necessarily sign up for, but can be important depending on where you're going. So in this fluffy video, we're going to talk about the two sides of that conversation, the horny side and the more thoughtful side of essentially being a villain, which is tangential to a monster, but not every monster is a villain. So before we get started, let's stand for the national anthem. Last year, AMC's Interview with the Vampire adapted Anne Rice's work, and in doing so, took many of the subtextual relationships and made it text, because they're not cowards. Lestat and Louis weren't just homoerotic with homoerotic subtext, they were a homosexual couple and toxic as fuck, and it was amazing. Louis in the incarnation is a gay black man, and Lestat was serving depraved bisexual mother realness, and it was fantastic.
Why do you do this, Lestat?
Well, I like to do it. I enjoy it.
Well, I don't.
It was a dark relationship that has a lot of non-book related complications due to the racial dynamics that were made when Louis went from being a white slave owner to a gay black man.
Yes, let's have this conversation again. Color, white, Creole, French, queer, half queer, mostly queer. What is it? Non-discriminating.
Lestat gets to be a rich white man in society, and Louis has to, at least outside, serve as his inferior in many ways. But despite all these racial tensions, the real issue for a lot of shippers was in episode 5, after Louis tries to leave with their daughter, sister figure Claudia, Lestat violently beats Louis. For those who have been shipping Lestat and Louis since the books, this was a moment that many felt went too far. This kind of overt abuse wasn't in the books, although you can argue that Lestat was very abusive in many other ways. But while this wasn't maybe book accurate, Lestat is shown to be, from the very beginning, emotionally cruel to Paul, who is Louis' brother struggling with mental illness, manipulative to Louis while he was human, and he punched a priest in the head. So before we even got to him abusing Louis, we see him to be emotionally manipulative, violent, petty, willing to play with anybody that he views as inferior morally, socially, and so on and so forth. You know, he cheats on Louis, tries to soft pitch him Polly, and then gets jealous when the relationship anarchy isn't working in his favor, which is... As anyone who's ever been who is poly and has been in a polyamorous relationship, ain't it just the way?
What can I say? I'm a lot. I'm not perfect.
All of these are red flags that led up to the abuse and make it clear that Lestat is not an emotionally secure person to have a relationship with, even though he is a dynamic, fascinating, compelling character that I also love. But what happened is that for a lot of people, when he showed this violence against Louis, it's when people who love Lestat and ship them felt conflicted. We saw the equivalent of vampire domestic abuse, and it became an issue of, well, can I still like X or ship X and Y? And if I do, am I problematic? What does it mean to now engage with this art, this character who we can establish is a problem?
You did what you did because it gave you pleasure. Companion of the dark gift, finally.
Problematic and problematic shipping is a term that in itself is problematic. Really making headway in the 2000s, it really entered the public lexicon for me with the Tumblr blog, Your Fave is Problematic. In a New York Times article, the creator of the blog talked about how, despite the noble intent, which you can see in its FAQ, in hindsight, it was an attempt to get power when they were in a place where they felt powerless. And that manifested in wanting to extract accountability from anyone who could be seen as having power and using it in the wrong way. In the years since, I've looked back on my blog with shame and regret about my pettiness, my motivating rage, my hard and fast assumptions that people were either good or bad. Who was I to lump together known misogynists with people who got tattoos in languages they didn't speak? I just wanted to see someone face consequences. No one who'd hurt me ever had. There's something almost quaint about it all now. Teenage me teaching myself about social justice on Tumblr while also posturing as an authority on that very subject, thinking I was making a difference while engaging in a bit of schadenfreude. Meanwhile, other movements, local, global, unified in their purposes and rooted in progressive philosophies, were organizing for actual justice. Looking back, I was more of a cop than a social justice warrior, as people on Tumblr had come to think of me. Now, I made this very YouTube channel when I was about 15, 16 years old, so I can assure you, I understand feeling as a young person who is getting involved, wanting to be engaged, feeling very motivated and strong in your convictions, and wanting to find some idea of justice. It can be very harrowing to walk through this world and see the death and destruction around you, and see the way in which people that give the signifiers of elitism really just stepping all over you. And also if you've dealt with trauma and seeing people not take responsibility for that in your own day-to-day, wanting to rectify that. I mean, that's a lot of the reasons why people who are bullied or are bullied both become cops. It's trying to find control. And I am certainly not proud of every single thing that I've done on this channel, especially as I was a young teenager, but I've also been happy to be able to grow and change and evolve with it. I also am right now much more understanding of nuances, and now that I've lived life, I think I just view things differently. When I was 15, I hadn't even been in a real relationship yet. I'd never dated, I never knew what love was. I was a very insular person, yet I walked and I spoke with this air of knowledge that in retrospect I find quite silly, but at the time it felt so true to me. And while there are certainly takes that I agree with, and I think that I had little seeds of knowledge from then, now when I look back at it, I see the anger and the frustration and the impotent rage behind a lot of my feelings and motivations, even if the thesis and the conclusion was right. How I was getting there sometimes was a little, because I was 15. Another quote from the article. My brain wasn't ready for nuance. I was angered by hypocrisy and cruelty. What I did about it was apply a level of scrutiny that left no room for error. And I get this. I wanted to do the same. I wanted to speak to the power. And I also think it's important and good to call in folks for problematic behavior, who are saying things, to ask questions about people who you trust and you want to be in community with. Yet sometimes it gets taken to a place where it becomes less about trying to teach or educate or clarify where people stand on something, and it becomes scolding for the sake of scolding. To bring this back to shipping, problematic shipping has come to mean a whole range of things, ranging from unhealthy dynamics to abusive relationships to actual illegal crimes to enemies to lovers with a little too much enemy in it. It has taken me a while to get here, but I can admit that I do enjoy relationships with a slightly fucked up dynamic. That's why I like Zutara. That's why I like Catradora. I do have healthy ships, I promise. But even something like Lumity has a little bit of enemies to lovers in them. More so, I'm attracted to dynamics where either someone changes for the better in order to be with their person out of their own desire, a la Beauty and the Beast, which is probably
I let her go.
How could you do that?
I had to.
Yes, but why?
Because I love her.
A source code in there somewhere, or what I'm gonna call Vegeta and Bulma bullshit. Akira Toriyama has a lot to answer for, even though I love his work. But even before I yell at him about Mr. Black and Mr. Popo, I need him to finally answer decades of shippers by explaining in extensive detail how Vegeta and Bulma got together. If you have gotten into Dragon Ball in any of the recent incarnations, you would have probably have seen the character of Vegeta as this wife guy with a rude attitude who, despite all that he has done, is known for being a goodish dad and an even gooder-ish husband. And I think this bears to be said. Vegeta is a war criminal. Like a former genocidal monster, militaristic person who killed an entire planet for the lulz. And because of the nature of Dragon Ball, because pretty much everyone that Goku fights either becomes his friend or he puts them in hell. And Vegeta happened to be one of those people who went to the good side. And then all of a sudden we do a time skip and he and Bulma have a baby. And we're just all supposed to just sit here and be like, okay. Well, thankfully Trunks is so hot that I remember that I saw Trunks and I said, if that's going to lead to this, then this must be holy because he is beautiful. But even so, I think that that's something that a lot of shows will do, is provide atonement through this catharsis factor. Like, Vegeta is a truly compelling and interesting character. He was stolen as a child. He's essentially a child soldier who was raised by someone who held him in slavery, and part of his ego and his bravado is a survival mechanism to maintain his own sense of pride, having survived the genocide of his race. And I think that when you lay that all down, even though he is a war criminal, it's what makes Vegeta interesting and compelling. Is he problematic? Sure. but is it problematic in a way that is narratively compelling? And I think this is where a lot of the issues lay when you talk about your villains and your antagonists and your anti-heroes, is what is the text saying about this character versus what the audience is putting onto the character in order to make them fit a dynamic that they want.
Actually, Romeo and Juliet's my favorite play.
Why is that not a surprise?
I'm sorry?
For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo.
Could you read it again?
This video is sponsored by Ren. I'm always nervous about accepting a sponsor outside of my wheelhouse, especially because I am not a scientist. Jim, I'm a video essayist, not a scientist. But after Wendover Productions did both a video explaining why carbon offsets don't work and then approved of Ren, it gave me the confidence to accept it not only as a sponsor, but to try it out myself. I believe in the idea behind Ren, and if you want more scientific outlooks, you can check out Wendover's video yourself. But for me personally, I find myself both frustrated about the looming fact of climate change, but also the ways in which it's treated as something that the average person can do nothing to help or stop. There's a lot of rhetoric that makes you feel very inadequate. And unlike Krista from Fern Gully, Queen of White Girl Dances, I cannot simp people into empathy. So we have to find other ways. We live in a world where, depending on where you live, our global footprint and everyday lifestyles creates a ton of CO2. And with the very little that our governments are doing, if we can take any little steps, it matters, at least to me. And with Ren, you can go on the website, calculate your carbon footprint, and then offset it So with Ren, you can go on the website, calculate what your carbon footprint is. Mine was slightly above average because of the flying I've done for work, and then offset it by funding a diverse mix of carbon reduction projects across the world. There's actual transparency about where their actions and money goes. So you have an actual sense of security about what you're investing in. And, they're not promising you things like titles. It's just very much like doing it for the good of the thing. And the two that really appealed to me and I thought were the most appealing that I thought people would appreciate are the Amazon Rainforest Protections, which gives indigenous Amazonians tools to help protect the rainforest at home. And it promotes biodiversity, prevents deforestation, and promotes indigenous land rights, which is very important to me. And then also the other one is Clean Cooking Fuel for Refugees that provides clean burning fuel and cook stoves for refugees in Uganda. There are over 1 million refugees, and this is helping to protect deforestation, reducing cooking emissions, and improve quality of life and lower risk of lung disease. So I think these are just tangible ways that you can put your money towards something good. And so I really appreciate Ren for not just, letting me do this and me being sponsored by them, but for doing the work to give credibility to their projects so that I could feel credible in promoting them. So go on the site, swallow up that little bit of shame when you see how your carbon emissions adds up. Maybe yours is lower than mine. Congratulations. And if you use the link below, the first 100 people who sign up will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. So I think that's wonderful. It's what Krista from Fern Gully would want. So let's clarify some terms. A villain and an antagonist can be the same thing, but not always. To use examples that most people will know, the Dark Lord Sauron is the villain of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings series. L in Death Note is the antagonist to protagonist Light Yagami. L is a detective trying to stop the serial killer murderer Kira while Light is said killer. But we follow the story from Light's perspective, which makes him the protagonist. An antagonist works in opposition to the protagonist. A villain can be a larger evil that needs to be destroyed, even if they don't directly come into conflict with the heroes. But the key thing before we get into the discourse thing is a term that is so important to understand if you're going to have fandom discourse about villains and villain fuckery and understanding these dynamics. And that is what I mentioned up at the top, Draco in leather pants. Draco in leather pants, or DILP, is what happens when you take a character who is in canon a bad person and say, but I can fix that.
I can fix that.
And craft them into a more headcanon or fanon accurate version of the character. If enough fan fiction does this, then it becomes a major meta canon into the fandom, to the point where it can absolutely cloud what people think about the character if they just enter the fandom. I have absolutely been dilped. Part of the reason why I like Zutara is because I got dilped before Zuko had his redemption train, because I started watching Avatar when book 2 was just coming out. So I saw a very out of context moment in the waterbending scroll, and I was like, this could work. Of course, eventually Draco is not actually a Draco in leather pants. Technically, Azula would be the dilp, even though I do think people tend to erase all of Azula's nuances and ignore that she's 14. But that's another situation. The term was, if you can't tell, based on the fandom version of Draco Malfoy from the Wizard book series, because fans found that character attractive, especially after Tom Felton was cast as the character. And in the third week, when they upgraded his wig girl, because before he was looking like Spike from Buffet, and then eventually they gave him like a little fringe, and he was looking very cute. Then Hermione punched him, and then all of a sudden, bisexuals were made. And they worked to create a more sympathetic and nuanced version of the character that I would argue is much better than the book version in a lot of ways, but that's for a whole nother discussion. But part of what they would do is fill in holes for characters because a lot of their backstory was underdeveloped, or they felt like there was something more interesting that was going on that was never actually dealt with in canon, especially when they're playing off a dynamic that really only had like a handful of interactions in canon. And I think that's one of the things I love about being in fandom, and being in specifically the metatextual place of fandom, is the desire to go beyond, to figure out and really understand the nuances of certain characters. And as someone who loves fanfics and hates that people suck at writing romances or compelling antagonists, this is something that I completely think is a great thing when it is a clear situation that there is book, canon, or canonical characterization of what we know about the character versus what you created for the character to make them more in line with what you think that character could have been if written better. Those are two valid things that can exist, but there needs to be an acknowledgement that those are two different things, that your fandom interpretation of Kylo's backstory, of his friendships with the Knights of Ren, all that stuff is interesting, compelling. You should do it, have fun with it. That is not on screen. And so that is the place where we will often see these discourses evolve, especially when you have a character with a sympathetic backstory. But fundamentally, what I think about this whole thing is that villains, bad guys, antagonists, characters who have fucked up majorly and are trying to go on their redemption arcs, and I put that in air quotes because sometimes it's not even really a redemption arc, it's more like a redemption, we said it, should be allowed to be those things. And we are still allowed to like them and lust after them, but we also need to be aware, even if we don't want to engage with it all the time, the layers that come with those discourses. So let's get into enemies to lovers and why a lot of people say they like it, but they're not ready for it.
I have never desired your good opinion, and you have certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. I'm sorry to cause pain to anyone, but it was most unconsciously done, and I hope will be of short duration.
Are you rejecting me?
I'm sure that the feelings which, as you've told me, have hindered your regard will help you in overcoming it.
Might I ask why, with so little endeavour at civility, I am thus repulsed?
And I might as well inquire why, with so evident a design of insulting me, you chose to tell me that you like me against your better judgment.
No, believe me, I
if
didn't
I
mean...
was uncivil, then that is some excuse, but I have other reasons. You know I have.
Enemies to lovers is a very super popular trope in romance, but the spectrum of it is vast. It really builds off the Pride and Prejudice pipeline of two people meet in a situation, vibe check's a little hazy, someone thinks that somebody else got an ego or something stush. Eventually, despite this early misconception, they realize they have more in common and they want to sit on each other's faces, and eventually they come together and they realize, I was tripping, you was tripping, like let's figure this shit out. I think the thing that happens is like a lot of these conflicts go from one person was being a bully to another person to things like, you're part of a fascist superpower that tried to erase my culture and my existence, but you got better. And I have this thing where I like to believe that between episodes, when these characters figure out their truth, they like read some bell hooks, like they all just read The Will to Change and was like, I can do better. And to me, the fact that this is a vast thing within fandom community, and I'm concentrating on fandom because this is where the discourse tends to happen. There are these two dueling perspectives. Let people like things and like the hypercritical stuff, right? And to me, I fundamentally am someone who likes things but is super critical of the things that I like because I enjoy that. I'm an English major. I like tearing things apart, putting them back together. I can love a show and still nitpick it to death. That fuels me. And I think like all that residue from Catholicism also leaves me with a lot of guilt and a lot of wanting to, at least by my own standards, meet a certain mark. And I think that can lead in many ways to people trying to hyper validate their feelings to not be seen as bad, like empirically bad. And I think one of the hard things about fandom as a collective is that fandom is not one thing. Community in online spaces is not one thing. You're talking about people who do not want to engage critically and just want to enjoy things, and people who do want to engage critically. And there used to be a time where you could just do that and it was separate. But now, because it's a constant clashing of things, you get this place where people feel like they have to validate every single thing and feeling they have about a bad guy to the point where they would whitewash their characteristics. And as I spoke about this in my cartoons and imperialism video way back when, there is a huge issue with creators taking the imagery of fascism, imperialism, and colonization and watering it down, because when you take a few characters from that moral landscape, humanize them, and redeem them, it will have various reactions from the audiences, because there are still people who are dealing with the trauma of the real life realities of those institutions. And so you can't always guarantee that you have really done this well. And while I may disagree with how some people critique certain shows about that, because I do think that there is a way to analyze media and call out the failings without putting harm into it, because we live in this reactionary space. When we're talking about fandom, it becomes hard to really engage in that dialogue in a thoughtful way where people can be heard and say how they feel, and people who want to enjoy things can hear that dialogue in good faith and take that with them and go in their own space. And I think there's also this idea with letting people like things that ignores the racism in fandom, the transphobia in fandom. And I say this with a lot of grace. There are a lot of white people who are a part of other marginalized intersections that really want to equate puritanical purity politics with wanting to constructively and critically dissect the issues that many of us have been speaking about for years and been silenced about. And do not take into consideration, even with the amount of grace that they want to give other people who fuck up, don't give the grace to those who are just tired. You know, there is no room for the exhaustion of having to explain 50 million times why we would be uncomfortable with people shipping a pseudo-fascist character with somebody, you know? And I think there's a fundamental thing where, like, we don't actually have to all accept that you like these things. You know, if you like a character that's tied to fascism, people are allowed to call that character fascist. That is what the character is. Like with Star Wars in particular, it's one of those franchises where fascist concepts are baked into the Empire, even though they're undefined. We saw Anakin's arc and we understand how he got there. He became a weapon for the same system that wouldn't have cared about him when he was enslaved, that emotionally manipulated him. There is a lot of moral nuance to why Anakin turns dark. He still kills younglings, though.
You killed younglings. You're going down a path I can't follow.
So we have to take all of that. And we can like a character and be critical of it. And we have to find a way to combine both of them, because what really I find is the most limiting thing is that people are so consumed with worrying about being seen as racist, problematic, etc., that they can't step back and think about the larger dynamics and issues that are a part of this. We don't consume anything in a vacuum. We do not live in a bubble. Our tastes, our everything is implied by things. And if you're going to say let people like things, you also need to accept that, like, not everyone is going to like things for valid reasons, and that we all have to deal with each other if we're going to be in the same space. And if we are doing it with people who we are choosing to be in community with. Because when I talk about this, I think one of the things that happens is, like, it becomes a bringing in of people that we wouldn't be in community with. You know, if you are a liberal progressive person and you're building your fandom community, you are already picking people who have the politics of you. So I'm not talking about reaching across the aisle to, you know, people who you are not in politics with. I'm talking about people who you are in politics with but have these differences, just to clarify, because there is a desire to sometimes ignore these things and say, like, I just want to enjoy things, that it takes away the fact that, like, you can enjoy things. And we live in a racist society, and that has to be dissected. And if you don't want to deal with that, then you need to take yourself out of those discussions. Like, just don't engage with it. Like, and I think this is really why there is so much weird beef between so many people in Reylo, because Reylo is not inherently a racist ship. It's not. The racial dynamics of the way that the Star Wars sequel series was done and promoted and marketed is problematic. And the way the writers made Reylo a central part of the series further pushed down characters of color in terms of the prominence of what they were allowed to do. That is the problem. That is why people are upset about it. That's why people initially, for the most part, didn't like Reylo from my perspective. Is that every single person? No. But if we're talking about, again, people that we want to be in community with, people that are actually doing criticism, this is that issue. And the thing that I know happens, because I've been here, is that when you get told that your ship is something and you're seeing this criticism, there's a fight or flight instinct where you're like, I gotta either double down or I gotta run. And sometimes, especially if you're in an echo chamber, you double down. And as someone who ships problematic things, one of the best things I ever did was find a community within fandom that already shared the same justice views I did. That way I could be in community with people who already did the work and knew how to tackle these issues in a productive, educated way and still enjoy the thing. So rather than internalize every Zutara, Dramini, or Sansan call out, I could just scroll. But that is very, very hard to do because of how social media promotes itself, and it's hard to do now. And I will say this, I still, like, I know people, like, I mentioned that I shipped Dramini in another video and people will just be like, what? And, like, you know, talk about certain things, and they're not wrong. It just, when you've done the work, it can just be so grating to be treated like you haven't done it. You know, that is something that I did. I think I don't know what the word for that is, but it's exhausting. I had a thing with this of two friends of mine. We were at a cafe talking about Phantom of the Opera, and this other person goes, well, you know, that's a little problematic because he kind of kidnaps her. And we're just all sitting here like, we're all academics. We're all feminists. We have all talked about rape culture. Like, sis, we are aware. Like, who was that comment for? Because it certainly wasn't doing anything to create a dialogue. It was just for you to be like, well, and so we didn't like her after that. And it's like, again, it's not an invalid thing to say. But why are you bringing it up in a space that you couldn't believe has already expressed that? Good faith is used and swung up a lot in conversations, but what's often ignored is that you can only respond in good faith when you feel like you are being approached in good faith. And it's very, very rare that happens and people are confronting you or calling you out in a way that is supposed to be good faith in the long run. But the downside to this, that ties into the point of this video, is that when we project goodness or badness or just morality onto what people like and how they write characters, you create this space where we can't have actual media analysis of things without it being seen as a judgment on said person. Like, I don't fuck with Daemon Targaryen. I don't like him. I don't respect him. But I get why people like him. I think it's possible to appreciate the nuance of his character without trying to woobify him. I really thirst after Endeavor on My Hero Academia, and I still think that he needs to take every single L his children give him. Like, I like him as a character. I find his arc compelling, but I can't say I find his arc compelling if I can't admit where he started. I like him in part because of how problematic and fucked up his arc is and what it says about him. Well, I like him because he looks like he has a huge, but that's my problematic side. That's the hoe side.
Cook my meat.
The academic side is like, I am also really interested in engaging in a long-term arc that is trying to discuss these issues. And I think that I talked with my therapist about this, and like a part of the reason why I am attracted to these stories is because I like the idea of seeing conclusions that do not happen often in real life. I like the idea of something problematic being solved within a text and having a happy ending. And to talk about also owning the characters that we like that are villains. Like, take Regina Mills, the best character on Once Upon a Time.
I want you all to know what I feel, and that is regret. Regret that I was not able to cause more pain, inflict more misery, and bring about more death. And above all else, with every ounce of my being, I regret that I was not able to kill Snow White.
Wow, that was so powerful.
Started off as the evil queen, was the big bad in the first season. However, she got really popular because look at the material. And the issue of her being like a Latina mother who's the adoptive mother and her maternity being called into question, everyone kind of was like, this is a little sus. And so people were just very like, she had a huge community of people that were on her side. That being said, the show made it very clear in the first season that she is a... There is a scene where she takes the heart of the huntsman, and it is shown that when you have the heart of someone, you can control their actions. And she takes his heart and throws him and says, you know, take him to my bedchambers. That's rape. He cannot consent to that. And the writers never, first of all, the writers don't think it's rape, which is already red flag, red flag, red flag. And so when they've been asked about it, they're like, oh, well, like, he does like it. And, you know, it's all a bunch of bullshit. It's very clear that they never intended that to be seen as rape. But she did it. Ignoring that doesn't help anybody. Even a villain redeeming themselves, you should be able to have that shit. Just like them for being bad. Like, I love Lex Luthor. I love him. Him and Darkseid, ooh, yes, please. I love them. I don't want them to be good. I want them to be bad. I don't care. Like, there's this TikTok where like, I liked them when they were messy. And I feel that. Like, there sometimes films are just more interesting, better written, more compelling, and that's really all of it. And it sucks sometimes because sometimes you want to root for the good guy, and there are times I definitely do, but sometimes the good guy is boring and underwritten and responsive, and the bad guy be making some sense. Okay? Magneto? Demona? Like, sometimes these characters who are placed as villains have just so much more going on for them that you are drawn into them just from a literary moment. It doesn't take away that they're murderers or killers or any of that. We can discuss that. But I think the big issue is when all of a sudden appreciating that writing, appreciating that character trait gets put into this moral grandstanding. And I think you see this a lot actually with Gillian Flynn. I have seen people like talk about Gillian Flynn and say that they think that she is a misogynist because she writes characters like Amy Dunn from Gone Girl, like women who like lie. Like, I think the whole thing with Amy is that she lies about sexual assault and uses that as a thing. And I deeply dislike that idea because, one, as she's a writer, and I think that as a writer, especially a writer who wants to write female characters, it's compelling to write a sociopath. It's compelling to write that character and play off of the sort of like toxic femininity of like white womanness as a thing that Amy herself is using. I mean, here's the thing, we talk about that so much in pulp culture, that like Amy is the perfect encapsulation of like a brilliant sociopath who has like, you know, her speeches and everything, but you know she's still a bad person. She's a murderer, she's a killer, and in the book she's even worse. And it shows that it's not just men but women as well. And that's what makes it fascinating. That's what makes it interesting. It's a well-written character. Because she writes evil women does not mean that Gillian Flynn is like a rape abuse apologist or anything. And it sucks to see that. And she said that part of the reason why she wrote cruel characters is because she was not a nice little girl. She wrote like a whole essay about this on Medium. I think women like to read about murderous mothers and lost little girls because it's our only mainstream outlet to even begin discussing female violence on a personal level. Female violence is a specific brand of ferocity. It's invasive. A girl fight is all teeth, hair, split ends, and nails. A much more fearsome thing to watch than two dudes clobbering each other. Like, she is genuinely like attracted to that fairy tale, dark, feminine aesthetic and taking it and putting it into her writing and writing these really amazing villains. And that's who they are. They're villains. They're bad guys. And that is okay. I think also when it comes to like female villains, you know, I don't know if you know this, but much like Westeros, we also live in a patriarchy. And so sometimes you just want to see, you know, women behaving badly. It doesn't mean that we can't be like, I think that's what's so interesting about like the discourse around House of the Dragon and how like they're like everyone's evil. It's like everyone's evil, but we can talk about like the systems that build it. Like everyone so wants to just create either no moral ground or like keep trying to like fight each other about who has the right moral ground, that we can't just actually talk about the systems that create these characters, which is the interesting part. Like, yes, both Rhaenyra and Alicent are upholding their own brand of white feminism, but what does white feminism look in Westeros as we have shown in House of the Dragon? Is there a actual feminism, or are we applying like certain standards to it? Like, how is Rhaenyra's actions different than Alicent's, even though they're both working in a fucked up power structure? You know, like, these are conversations worth having. We can say like they're both bad because they both do morally ambiguous things, but let's discuss where those ambiguities come from, why those choices were made, what they say about what the writers want us to discuss about these characters. Like, that's why we have villains, to create foils and conversations. And like, I don't know, like if we try to strip away all of their wickedness, their flaws, the things that make them bad, we are stripping away the things that made them interesting to us to begin with. Like, if you, like with Kylo, for example, like we don't know a lot about why he got turned to evil in the films, as because I know there's other comics and shit from the films is very weak, but you can just think about what it must be like to be like the grandson of like the greatest villain the Empire ever had, to feel this draw towards the darkness, what it means about you, and growing up with the legacy of like having the heroes. Like, we literally saw that play out with Avatar, with The Legend of Korra. You know, like, that's a whole interesting arc that you could have for a character that could make you sympathize with him. Like, why choose the First Order and not just choose a third path? You know, why repeat the mistakes of your grandfather and not just find a different path? That's interesting. But you can't have that if you can't accept that at a certain moment of choice, he chose the First Order, which is a pseudo-fascist organization. And that says something about something that he needed as a character. And that's, like, compelling to think about. And if you don't accept the fascism, you're losing half the discourse. And I think, like, I don't, like, again, there's no thesis to this video. It's more just me talking about these things. And also, I'm just so burnt out from the live stream I did before, and like I wrote a script and I'm working off of it, but I'm also just kind of like so tired of like talking and thinking. Gaston was right. Thinking is annoying. Take it back, God. I even think about villains like Ursula and Maleficent, and like the reason why I loved them growing up is because they, one, were othered, and I think that queer other coding happens a lot with villains and creates a natural connection. But then also they just don't give a fuck. They don't have respectability politics. They can be free. And I think sometimes I'm just drawn to the freedom of what it means to be bad, to be free of guilt. You know, I feel like I live with guilt every single day of my life. And so it's nice to watch characters who don't feel that, who can just be fierce and don't give a shit. And I think that's something that we can embrace while still holding them accountable in the text that is given. And I think really what people are trying to avoid is feeling bad. And feeling bad about liking a bad guy. And I'll tell you what, I don't think you should feel bad for liking a bad character in fiction unless they are literally a Nazi or a Klansman. And then yes, you just gotta take the L sometimes. Like people judge me all the time for what I like. Like judgment sucks. There's like, I literally break into tears when people say that I've disappointed them. Like it, but you have to learn to deal with it sometimes, not because it's fair, but because it's not necessarily always about you. People don't often know your character. They don't know who you truly are, and they can only go off what they've been dealt with. And it's hard. It's hard to be out here and to deal with the fact that we all want escapism. But if we tweet about something, then we're going to have 25 people giving us their opinions. Like I've had to actually, if I have feelings about something, tell myself not to tweet because I don't actually want to engage in discourse with people unless I'm doing a content about it. I don't want to do that every time. I don't want everything that I like to be vivisected about me to shape a narrative about me that doesn't really exist. In rough conclusion, I think the whole reason I made this video is because one, a bunch of people that I also follow who are also Black folks were talking about this issue, and I think we all kind of have the same thing. Like we all all of us like villains. We like monsters. We like the dynamics. We just also want people to engage with this with their eyes open, to, like I said before, like love it and enjoy it, but be aware. And I think that sometimes people treat awareness as if it's trying to burden you. And it's like, it can be burdensome at times, but I think it is important to at least be aware, you know, and to learn how not to, you know, how not to argue in a way that doesn't actually help you. You know, I think sometimes when you're not in community with people and you're just spiraling, you forget how to just like really sit with your feelings and discuss and know how you feel and have that confidence. And I got that because I was in really good Tumblr spaces. And I really wish more people had that, because I think it can be so refreshing and freeing, because I definitely find that there is more of a balance than we allow ourselves to have. This video is not a video essay. It is more just a collection of thoughts. But doing so, when I go back and I edit my videos, I try to make sure that I am catching flaws in my own argument. And one counter argument that I think that I thought of as I was editing this video is, well, what about people who are triggered by certain characters? And what about the fact that villains can be certain kinds of characters? You know, I mentioned that Regina is a canon even though the writers do not deal with it. Especially in the 2010s and 2000s, there were a lot of characters who engaged in dubious consent that never really dealt with the actions because the writers sort of normalized it as a thing. I'm thinking of Damon Salvatore, who very much Caroline Forbes, but it was never treated as rape because he's still gotta be the hero. And it's like, does every character that likes Damon have to ignore that he is a rapist because the writers want to? And to me, I think that the answer is no, because the issue isn't simply that Damon committed sexual assault, even though that's obviously a major issue with the character. The core issue to me is that he committed sexual assault and the writers didn't see that. had so much internalized misogyny, had so much internalized rape culture, that they normalized this thing with their hero. Letting people like things is a good idea in theory. And I think even in this video, I feel as if I am trying to find a way to do both things. But I think ultimately, for me, I think that people are allowed to like whatever they like. We can't go into people's mind and actively stop them from liking things. But when there are accusations of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, it is worth being introspective about it. It's hard to know how to protect yourself. And that's why I think tagging and content warnings are so important, because we are so often unable to have the power to protect ourselves that I think it's important to have that power as much as possible when it's available. And when it comes to this, I would never argue with somebody who is a survivor of child abuse that Endeavor is a good person. However, I would push back if someone said that I believe that child abuse is okay because I like Endeavor, because that's not the same thing. And as someone who is mostly in this community with a lot of queer folks and femmes and women and people who are marginalized, whenever this villain conversation comes up, the thing I always see is people saying that they like villains because villains are willing to sacrifice everything for the people they love and willing to fight for them. And I think what that speaks to on a deeper level, if I can do like psychobabble for a few seconds, is that people are attracted to these characters who seem that when shit is about to get real, step up, who are going to actually fight for something and mean it. And let's be real, like, it's not all good that we're talking about, but that mentality, this idea that like they'll burn down the whole earth for you, is an attractive concept in a world where love and care and protection can sometimes seem so far away. So I think that we also need to start realizing that like Twitter is not all discourse when it comes to villains. Like the Good for Her universe is fabulous and I love it, and I love it as a meme culture, but it's funny to me how so many people have tried to be like, well, like these are the equivalent of women who don't understand Fight Club, and I'm like, don't turn us into this. Like, if I say Amy Dunn did nothing wrong, I'm not excusing homicide. I'm not excusing all of her actions. I'm just saying, God, she looked great doing it. I want to see her do it again. So again, I just want us to understand that media analysis can also mean understanding why these characters that we like are not doing good things, but sometimes we just want to like be silly online. And sometimes the silver-haired guy with a sapphire in his eye riding a dragon who accidentally kills his nephew is like kind of bae. I am looking forward to just seeing how people feel about this topic. Who are some villains that you love? Who are some villains that you feel guilty about loving? And who are some characters that you used to love, but as things went on, you felt differently about them? I'd love to know what you think. And again, I love different opinions. I am opening myself up for the discourse, but just be nice to other people. Discourse, argue it with me, discuss it with me, have a conversation with me, but be nice to your fellow commenter. That is all. Hello, if you made it to the end of the video, you have made it to the Discord Patreon Q&A. So I am answering the comments from my Discord. I apologize for the delay. It has been chaotic. From Kiss My Converse, what are my top 5 favorite literary characters of all time? Now this changes almost constantly, but I would say overall it's Sarah Crew from A Little Princess. Don't laugh, but Sansa Stark from Game of Thrones, because I ride or die for my queen. Diane from Tamora Pierce's The Immortals. I'm blanking on her name at this very, very moment, but I love the main character in the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. And Shirley, of course, because you know this is an Anne of Green Gables stand account. I ride or die for my redheaded queen all day, every day. From Rachel, if I got to cast Zack Snyder's Justice League, who would I pick? Would you change the character lineup at all? Y'all know that I don't stand for Cyborg being a member of the JL. Cyborg is a member of the Teen Titans, but I would want to keep Ray, so I think I would actually just cast Ray as, well, not John Stewart because he's a little light skinned for that, but I totally can see him being Hawkman. I wish I could see what his comedic chops would be, because I thought maybe he'd be like a bulky Wally, but I think for me I would have it be Wonder Woman, Batman, Superman, Black Canary, so that we have more than just one woman, Wally West is Flash, and the Green Lantern Jon Stewart edition. From Mysterious Squeaky Toy, what video games are you playing right now? What do you like about them? What kind of games do you like in general, and what do you like about them mechanically or otherwise? Well, right now I'm like playing Fire Emblem Engage, and I really love the Fire Emblem series. Honestly, I really like it because of the support system. I like making people fall in love in keys. And I've just loved those games since I was a kid. I think the reason I love turn-based RPGs is because I can pause and just come right back to it and nothing will ever hurt me. I do think that the element of repetition at the beginning of playing each game can be very taxing. I do still really enjoy it as something that is a part of the game. Part of why I like Pokemon is that regardless, I can always pick it up and play it new. And that's what made Arceus so interesting, because it was like the first time I was playing like new Pokemon that was both familiar but interesting. But I've been trying to play more different kind of games. Like I'm going to get Forspoken, even though I know I got totally trashed. I'm just waiting for it to go on sale because they canceled my pre-order twice, but when they were changing the date, so that's their loss. Civ 6 is my passion. I play it for quote unquote 5 minutes a day. I love Slay the Spire, and I'm just like doing my best not to just wear my eyes out on my Steam Deck. And also I'm almost at 100% on Hades, so that's pretty much what I'm focusing on right now. From Loot Pack Jack, when was the last time you had a punch up a fight? Wow, I have not had a fight or anything that could come close to like a physical altercation since like 7th or 8th grade. One of those grades. I don't be in these streets like that. Kiss My Converse again. What hobby do you have that surprised you when you first tried it? That's a really interesting one. I don't do it as much as I would like to, but I really like cross-stitching. What song do you use during your video credits? Is a question from Rachel. I think it's just one of the generic sounds that's on Final Cut. It is nothing special, but I'm glad that you think it's catchy. And the final question from Kiss My Converse, what kind of music have you been listening to lately? Don't laugh, but right now my top played song is the Separate Ways cover from Daughtry and Lizzie from Hailstorm. I love rock music, I love metal, I like Journey. I blame my 17% white side. So I've been listening to that a lot, as well as like the new SZA album is fire, and since I got tickets to see Paramore and Renaissance, I'm preparing myself emotionally by jamming out to those songs.